There is a quiet that exists not as an absence, but as a presence. It is a different kind of room. For some, the door to this room is always open. They step inside and the world with its constant demand for sound falls away. This is not a retreat from life, but a descent into a different stratum of it. It is a choice, a temperament, a deep and often misunderstood orientation of the soul, to stand at the shore of a crowd and feel the pull of the inner tide, turning away from the noise to listen to a more subtle frequency. This is the landscape of the mind that prefers solitude, not lonely, not antisocial, simply attuned to a different, quieter music. The door closes not with a slam but with a soft, definitive click, and in its wake the quality of the air changes, the dense hum of shared existence, the overlapping conversations, the ambient electronics, the traffic of other lives fades into a new frequency, silence. But it is not an empty silence, it is a fertile one. For the mind that seeks it, solitude is not a void left by the absence of others. It is a space that fills with a different kind of presence. It is a room of one's own, not made of plaster and wood, but of perception itself. Here, the self can finally stop performing the continuous, subtle adjustments required by the social world. The muscles of the face soften, the posture held in a public shape relaxes into its private geometry. It is a physiological unclenching, a homecoming. Watch this mind in its natural habitat. It is late afternoon and the sun cuts a long, slow angle across the floor. They are not doing nothing, they are listening to the rhythm of their own breath, to the slow unfurling of a thought from its nascent seed to a fully formed idea without interruption. There is no need to translate this internal process into external language, no need to justify, explain, or edit for an audience. The thought is allowed to be complex, contradictory, and entirely its own. This is the deep work of integration, a process that requires not stimulation, but the absence of it. Consider the walk taken alone. For this mind, it is not a journey from A to B, it is a moving meditation. The feet on the pavement set a rhythm that stills the internal chatter. The eyes are free to absorb the world without the obligation to comment on it. They notice the fractal pattern of a frost-veined leaf, the way shadow pools in a doorway, the precise color of the sky in the minute before dusk. These observations are not collected for later sharing, they are sensations felt for their own sake. They are nutrients absorbed directly into the psyche, feeding a rich inner world that thrives on such unmediated experiences. This sanctuary is a place of sensory restoration. In a world of constant competing inputs, the brain is an overworked filter, sifting through a torrent of data. Solitude is the power to switch off the fire hose. It allows the nervous system, often strung tight by the demands of others, to find its baseline again. The sound of rain against a window becomes a melody, the weight of a book in the hand a comfort, the taste of a meal singular and profound. Without the distraction of conversation, the senses sharpen. The world becomes more vivid, more directly experienced, because it is not being processed through the lens of another's perspective. This is often mistaken for loneliness, but loneliness is a sharp, aching absence. It is the feeling of a bridge that cannot be crossed. Solitude in its pure form is the opposite. It is a feeling of plenitude. It is the deep, humming satisfaction of a system operating at its optimal capacity without friction. It is the mind finally able to touch its own contours, to map its own vast and intricate landscape. It is where the scattered pieces of the self, pulled in a dozen directions throughout the day, are gently gathered back together and made whole. The person in this quiet room is not hiding. They are not sad. They are perhaps at their most authentic. The performance is over. The masks are put away. Here there is no need to be interesting or agreeable or entertaining. There is only the permission to simply be, to let the mind wander its own paths, to follow a thread of memory, to daydream without purpose, to simply exist in a state of unproductive being. In a culture that venerates output, this is a radical act of inner maintenance. It is the silent, steadfast work of tending to the core of one's own consciousness, ensuring it remains intact, sovereign and sound. Where does this preference begin? Is it a choice, a learned behavior, or something more deeply etched into the very blueprint of a person? The answer lies not in events of a life, but in its foundational substrate, in the raw material of the self. Long before the first conscious decision to seek a quiet corner, the inclination was already there, a latent potential. It can be seen in the child who, at a bustling birthday party, is found not in the center of the squealing chaos, but at its periphery, deeply engrossed in the mechanics of a single fallen leaf. This is not a sign of maladjustment. It is the first flowering of a specific temperament. The world for this child is not a broad social stage to be conquered, but a deep, complex system to be understood. And understanding for them requires a certain quality of attention that is only possible alone. Science offers a lens for this, the concept of innate temperament observed in infants. Only hours old reveals a spectrum of sensitivity. Some nervous systems are like robust filters processing the world in broad, resilient strokes. Others are like fine-tuned instruments registering every subtle shift in light, sound, and emotion. For the highly sensitive, the world is louder, brighter, more intense. A crowded room is not just a social event, it is a symphony of overwhelming data, the clatter of plates, the cross-current of a dozen conversations, the unspoken emotions flickering across faces. Solitude, then, becomes a necessary refuge. It is the quiet room where the instrument can recalibrate, where the volume of existence can be turned down to a bearable level. This is often conflated with shyness or social anxiety, but the root is different. Shyness is a fear of social judgment. The preference for solitude is not driven by fear, but by different economy of energy. For the introverted brain, a well-documented neurobiological orientation, social interaction is metabolically costly. It requires significant cognitive load, processing language, reading nonverbal cues, formulating responses, managing one's own presentation. It is a high-energy expenditure activity. Solitude, by contrast, is a state of low-energy expenditure. It is where the mind can recharge, not because people are draining in a negative sense, but because the act of engaging with them is a complex and resource-intensive task. The architecture is also shaped by the inner world's inherent richness. From a young age, some children discover that the landscape of their own imagination is as compelling, if not more so, than the external world. They do not need a playmate to populate a universe. They can generate their own characters, stories, and conflicts. Internally, this self-sustaining inner theater becomes a default, a place of comfort and limitless exploration. The external social world, with its rules and negotiations, can feel slow and cumbersome by comparison. Why spend an hour negotiating the rules of a game with others when you can, in the privacy of your own mind, instantly be the commander of a starship or the explorer of an ancient ruin? This temperament is a deep, structural part of the personality, as fundamental as height or bone structure. It is not a wound to be healed, not a scar from a forgotten trauma. Though life experiences can certainly layer upon it, a painful social experience might teach someone that solitude is safer, but for the mind wired this way, solitude was always the more attractive harbor. The trauma merely confirmed what the temperament already knew. The core of it is a positive pull toward the internal, not a negative push away from the external. It is a love of depth over breadth, of concentration over diffusion, of the intricate, private world within over the sprawling public world without. It is the way they are built, the fundamental architecture of their being, and the origin point of a lifelong relationship with quiet. From the outside, it looks like stillness, but within the quiet mind, a brilliant chaos is being ordered. This is the cognitive crucible, the private mental space where experience is smelted into understanding, where scattered impressions are forged into coherent thought. Solitude is not a passive state of doing nothing. It is the active, essential condition for the mind to do its most profound work. Neuroscience has given a name to this background hum of cognition, the default mode network. When the brain is not focused on an external, goal-oriented task, this network Lights up, it is the engine of self-referential thought, of memory, of imagination. It is the mind turning inward to weave the tapestry of the self, for the mind that prefers. Solitude, this is not a fallback state, it is the home territory. It is in these unattended moments, staring out a window, walking a familiar path, lying in the half-world before sleep, that the brain makes its most unexpected connections. A problem that seemed insurmountable at a busy desk suddenly resolves itself on a solitary walk. The solution appears fully formed, as if gifted from some hidden part of the self. This is the fruit of the default mode at work, cross-pollinating memories, ideas, and feelings without the interference of conscious, directed effort. This is the birthplace of insight. Creativity is not a social process. It begins in the deep, private dialogue between the conscious mind and the vast repository of the unconscious. It requires a state of open monitoring, a receptive attention that allows disparate ideas to collide and merge, the noise of collaboration, of brainstorming, of constant feedback can drown out this subtle internal process. The mind in solitude is free to follow a hunch, to explore a dead end without the fear of looking foolish, to entertain a bizarre or heretical idea that would never survive the scrutiny of a group. The greatest innovations in art, science, and philosophy were not born in committees, but in the silent, solitary crucibles of individual minds, allowed to wander and wonder without interruption. Memory itself is consolidated in this quiet. The brain does not simply record events like a camera. It processes them, sorts them, and files them away, linking new experiences to old ones to create a continuous personal narrative. This process of memory consolidation is deeply compromised by a lack of downtime. When one stimulus immediately follows another, the brain has no opportunity to properly encode what it has just lived. Solitude provides the necessary pause. It is the blank page in the diary. After a long entry, the space that allows the ink of experience to dry and become permanent. It is where the jumble of the day is sorted, where trivialities are discarded, and where meaningful moments are integrated into the evolving story of a life. This cognitive style is one of depth processing. It is a refusal to skim the surface, where a more socially oriented mind might thrive on the rapid exchange of many ideas. The solitude-preferring mind seeks to dive deep into a single one. They turn it over and over, examining it from every angle, feeling its weight, testing its texture. They are not seeking a quick answer, but a true understanding. This deep dive is a form of intellectual and emotional digestion. It is how a book is not merely read, but absorbed, how a piece of music is not merely heard, but felt in the bones, how a conversation had earlier is not merely remembered, but truly understood hours later, in the quiet of one's own company. The crucible does not just hold thoughts, it refines them, burning away the superficial to reveal the essential truth at the core. Yet this inner orientation exists within a world that often views it with suspicion, a world that champions the extroverted ideal, the charismatic, the collaborative, the constantly connected. And so, the mind that finds its truth in solitude must also learn to bear the weight of the world's gaze. This is the landscape of conflict where an inner truth meets an outer expectation, and a quiet war is waged in the territories of identity and belonging. The pressure begins as a subtle ambient hum, a background radiation of social judgment. It is the well-meaning question from a relative: are you sure you don't want to come? You don't want to be alone. It is the label casually applied by colleagues. The quiet one, it is the look of pity from an acquaintance when you decline an invitation for the second time. These small moments accumulate, forming a narrative that is at odds with one's own self-perception. The world interprets the need for solitude as a symptom of sadness, of aloofness, of a lack of interest. It rarely occurs to the social world that the preference is not a deficit of warmth, but a different way of generating it, not a rejection of others, but a necessary embrace of the self. This external pressure inevitably becomes internalized. It seeds a quiet, persistent doubt. A voice that whispers, "Is there something wrong with me?" The act of choosing solitude which should feel like a homecoming, can be tinged with a sense of guilt, as if one is shirking a fundamental human duty to be social, to be available, to be on. They may force themselves to attend the party, to stay later, to talk more, performing a version of sociability that feels like a costume several sizes too small. The energy this performance requires is immense, and the subsequent crash, the necessary deep withdrawal that follows, only reinforces the feeling of being broken, of having a social battery with it. Frustratingly low capacity. The conflict is one of definitions. The social world operates on a shared dictionary where alone is a synonym for lonely. It cannot comprehend that for this mind, the two words are antonyms. Loneliness is a hollow ache, a feeling of isolation even in a crowd. The solitude they crave is a state of rich engagement, just with the internal rather than the external, but constantly having to translate one's own experience into a language the world understands is exhausting. It creates a schism between the authentic self and the performed self. The person laughing at the party may, in truth, be a ghost already, halfway back to the quiet room where their real thoughts reside. This weight manifests as a constant, low-grade negotiation with the expectations of others. It is the crafting of polite excuses, the strategic positioning near the exit, the internal calculation of how long one must stay to be considered normal before a retreat is permissible. It is the faint but constant awareness of being an outlier, of marching to a rhythm that others cannot hear, the mind that finds its clarity and creativity in solitude is often forced to defend that very state, to justify its own necessary conditions for existence. The greatest conflict is not with the world itself, but with the part of the self that has absorbed the world's message and now looks upon its own deepest nature with a questioning and sometimes critical eye. There comes a turning point, a moment or a slow accumulation of moments. When the negotiation ends, the internal argument, the guilt, the performance, it becomes too heavy to carry, the energy required to constantly translate one's nature for the outside world exceeds the energy required to simply live it. This is the threshold of acceptance. Not a dramatic public declaration, but a quiet private revolution, a shift from seeing the need for solitude as a flaw to be managed, to recognizing it as a fundamental truth, to be honored. This crossing often begins with exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness that comes from too many forced smiles, too many evenings spent in noisy rooms while the mind screams for silence. It is a system reaching its breaking point and finally refusing to comply. In that moment of surrender, a profound realization dawns, the attempt to cure this self was the very source of the sickness. The problem was never the love of quiet, it was the war waged against it. This is the pivotal insight, that wholeness lies not in fixing one's temperament, but in embracing it completely. Crossing this threshold is an act of giving oneself permission to leave the party when the energy is spent without concocting an elaborate excuse, permission to spend a Saturday with a book and no plans without a flicker of guilt, permission to value the quality of a single deep conversation over the quantity of a dozen superficial ones. It is the conscious decision to stop apologizing for the very architecture of one's being. This permission is not granted by a therapist or a friend, though their support may help. It is a sovereign act, a treaty signed with the self. The terms are simple: I will no longer betray my own nature for the comfort of your expectations. With this acceptance comes a recalibration of language. The internal narrative shifts. I should go becomes I choose not to go. I am antisocial becomes I am selectively social. I am hiding becomes I am restoring. This is not mere semantics. It is the rewiring of identity. It is claiming the power to define one's own experience. The gaze of the world loses its power when one stops looking at oneself through its lens. The person who has crossed this threshold understands that their responsibility is not to be relatable, but to be authentic. Their loyalty is not to a social calendar, but to their own well-being. This is not a rejection of the world, but a more discerning engagement with it. It is the understanding that to be truly present for others, one must first be present for oneself. that the best version of themselves they can offer to the world is the one that is rested, integrated and rooted in its own truth. The threshold of acceptance is the moment the door to the inner sanctuary is no longer closed with a sense of shameful secrecy, but held open with the quiet dignity of a curator tending to a priceless internal museum. It is the end of the civil war within and the beginning of a peaceful, purposeful reign. Acceptance is not an end point, it is the beginning of a practice. The final stage is not a life lived in perpetual hermetic silence, but the masterful crafting of a life that moves with intention and grace between two worlds. This is the art of equilibrium. Deliberate ongoing dance between the sanctuary within and the world without, each giving meaning and texture to the other. The mind that has made peace with its own nature no longer sees a binary choice. Solitude or society, it sees a spectrum. It learns to build bridges between these states, creating a sustainable ecosystem for the self. This begins with the cultivation of thresholds, rituals, and spaces that ease the transition. The walk home after work, deliberate shedding of the social skin, the few minutes of quiet in the car before entering a bustling home, the morning coffee taken alone in silent preparation for the day. These are not escapes but airlocks. They allow for a gradual decompression, conscious shifting of gears that prevents the jarring friction of moving too quickly from one state of being to another. This art also involves the conscious design of a life that structurally honors the need for solitude. It is the career that allows for deep, focused work over constant collaboration. It is the home with a corner dedicated to thought, a chair by a window that looks onto trees. It is the social circle, carefully curated, that understands a declined invitation is not a personal rejection, and that values the depth of a quarterly, hours-long conversation over the frequency of weekly small talk. This is a life built not by accident but by design. An architecture of existence where the walls are placed to protect the quiet at its core. Within this structure, connection itself is transformed. It is no longer a diffuse, draining obligation to be sociable, but a series of deliberate, meaningful engagements. Because the inner well is consistently tended, the water drawn from it is clear and deep. When this person chooses to be with others, they are truly present. They are not halfway out the door, their energy already depleted. They listen more deeply, they speak with more consideration, they offer a quality of attention that is rare in a world of distracted chatter. Their relationships are not broad, but they are profound. They understand that the capacity to be alone is the very prerequisite for being able to be truly together with another. Intimacy for them is not about losing oneself in another, but about two whole selves meeting at the border of their respective sanctuaries. And so, the mind that prefers solitude is not a mind in retreat from the human experience. It is a mind that experiences it at a different depth, in a different key. It is the deep-sea diver who must spend long hours on the surface, preparing and recovering for those profound descents into the silent, pressurized depths. The world above is necessary, beautiful, and real, but the true treasures, the luminous and strange wonders, are found in the quiet below. The art is in knowing how long to stay down and when to come up for air. It is a rhythm unique to the individual, a pulse between engagement and withdrawal that sustains a whole and vibrant life. In the end, it is a reconciliation, understanding that this is not a flaw to be corrected, but a rhythm to be lived. It is the quiet mind, finally at home in its own skin, moving through the noise of the world not as an intruder, but as a visitor from a different, equally valid country. It tends its inner garden with the same devotion others give to their social networks, and in that garden it finds not loneliness but a profound conversation with existence itself, a conversation that requires no words, only a deep and abiding presence. It has found its place in the spectrum of human being, and in doing so has become entirely and peacefully itself.